I still remember the way the phone receiver felt in my hand the night everything changed. The ridged plastic pressed against my sweaty palm, a small, mundane detail that became suddenly ominous, like a silent prelude to the horror that would soon grip my world. Even now, I replay that moment in my mind, haunted by the knowledge of what followed. It was only late October, dark early and cold enough to see your breath swirl in the air outside the station window. I'd just clocked in for my overnight shift at the small ambulance dispatch center where I worked, never suspecting that this was the evening I'd be dragged into a nightmare I still can't fully escape. I sat alone in the dispatch office, a cramped space permeated by the faint odor of stale coffee and disinfectant, the heavy hush of the night shift broken only by the persistent hum of fluorescent lights overhead. My coworkers were either out in the field or off duty, leaving me in charged solitude with the phone lines. On my desk, the digital clocks flashed an unearthly red, ticking away seconds, turning them into an eternity. The night was settling around me, thick and claustrophobic, and I felt oddly breathless, as though something had already gone wrong. That primal sense of dread refused to let me relax, tensing my muscles and making my heart hammer against my rib cage. The phone rang, jolting me out of my uneasy reverie. The sound cracked the silence like a gunshot. I forced my trembling hand to pick it up. "Station 14, Dispatcher Kate," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I expected the usual request for a non-emergency transport, maybe some typical inquiry about schedules. But the silence on the other end stretched on, taut as a string about to break. "Hello?" I repeated, glancing at the caller ID. Nothing. Then, suddenly, static sputtered. Through the line, crackling like bone-dry leaves in a fire, a man's voice emerged, barely above a whisper. "It's David," he said. Susan's not doing well." My stomach clenched. Susan was a regular patient of ours. In her late 70s, frail and sweet, she was the kind of person who reminded me of my grandmother. We transported her to dialysis 3 times a week for what felt like ages. Everyone at our small station knew her, either by direct contact or by name alone. And we knew David, her middle-aged son, who usually sounded distant and curt. But I also knew he was protective of his mother, almost obsessively so at times. "I'm sorry to hear that, David," I said quietly. "Is she in any immediate distress? Do you need an ambulance to come get her?" He paused, the hush over the line thick with tension. My pulse raced, though I couldn't fully explain why. Perhaps it was the slight rasp in his voice, or the crackle of the line that made it sound like he was calling from somewhere far away, somewhere not entirely of this world. "No," he whispered eventually. "She'll be fine. She's just too tired to go to her appointment right now. I'll call if anything changes." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me with a heavy sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. Something in his tone, in the way the static lingered, told me there was more to the story. But I forced myself to focus on my job. People call in all sorts of states of distress or confusion, especially when caring for sick family members. I tried to shake off the chill settling over me. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me with a heavy sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. Something in his tone, in the way the static lingered, told me there was more to the story. But I forced myself to focus on my job. People call in all sorts of states of distress or confusion, especially when caring for sick family members. I tried to shake off the chill settling over me. Little did I know, that phone call would be the first tug on the thread that would unravel the entire night, and my own sense of peace, too. I'd been a dispatcher for a few years by then, and I considered myself fairly seasoned. That night, though, was different from the start. Even before David's call, I'd felt an unspoken heaviness in the air, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on me. Normally, the nights at Station 14 carried a sense of routine, a lullaby of radio chatter, ambulance checks, the hum of the city. We weren't in some remote wilderness, after all. Our little station served a suburban sprawl near a big city in the middle of the country, a patchwork of quiet neighborhoods, farmland, and industrial zones. It should have been a relatively calm shift. After David hung up, I sat there for a while, staring blankly at the phone. My hands refused to stop shaking. Something about his voice replayed in my mind, a note that I couldn't quite place. Exhausted? Grief-stricken? Disturbed? I didn't know, but a cloying sense of dread thickened in my throat. I tried to breathe deeply and refocus. My job was to prioritize calls, coordinate ambulance crews, and ensure our patients got the care they needed. Susan was a dialysis regular. If she couldn't make her appointment, that was unusual but not unheard of. Often patients would call us to say they felt too weak to go. Dialysis is draining, both physically and mentally. But usually Susan's doctors insisted she come in no matter how weak she felt. Something didn't align. The phone rang again and I jumped. My nerves were already frayed. This time, it was one of our ambulance crews calling in. They'd just finished dropping off a patient at the hospital and were running through the routine check with me. When I heard the comforting voices of my co-workers, for a moment my chest loosened. Familiar chatter about vitals, triage, and the next assignment eased the knot in my stomach. By the time I ended the call, I had almost convinced myself that David's strange manner was just stress or exhaustion. But that sense of dread refused to vanish entirely. It nipped at the edges of my mind while the slow hours ticked by. At one point, I went to the break room to pour another cup of stale coffee. The overhead lights flickered, giving the hallway an erratic, pulsing glow that rattled my nerves. My footsteps echoed hollowly. The station was never quite bright or welcoming, but that night it felt like a cold labyrinth of dark corners and hidden eyes. When I returned to my desk, the air felt colder, as though someone had left a door open to the chilly autumn outside. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else had entered. Nobody was there. Just me, alone, with the phone lines and that persistent sense that something was watching. By the time dawn began to break, I was thoroughly exhausted. My shift ended in a couple of hours, and I waited anxiously for the next dispatcher to relieve me. The phone rang a few more times. Routine calls for medical transports, a few check-ins from ambulance crews. But David never called back. Worse still, my attempts to follow up with him later that night went straight to voicemail or rang endlessly. My worry for Susan grew with every unanswered call, but I had no formal reason to send an ambulance. There was no direct request, no sign of an emergency except for that subtle alarm in my gut. By the time dawn began to break, I was thoroughly exhausted. My shift ended in a couple of hours, and I waited anxiously for the next dispatcher to relieve me. The phone rang a few more times. Routine calls for medical transports, a few check-ins from ambulance crews. But David never called back. Worse still, my attempts to follow up with him later that night went straight to voicemail or rang endlessly. My worry for Susan grew with every unanswered call, but I had no formal reason to send an ambulance. There was no direct request, no sign of an emergency except for that subtle alarm in my gut. Finally, the next dispatcher arrived, and I handed over my notes, pointedly mentioning the call from David. "Something about this is off," I told my relief. They nodded but looked unconvinced. After all, we had plenty of relatives calling in confusion or panic before. Not all of them turned into a major incident. I left the station feeling drained, my mind a fog of exhaustion and unease. I tried to sleep, but my dreams were plagued by images of a dimly lit living room, static flickering on a television screen, and a thin figure slouched in a chair, turned away from me so I could never see its face. In my dream, the figure's chest never rose or fell, just remained unnervingly still. I woke in a sweat, chest heaving, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was desperate to get out. The dream was so vivid, so claustrophobic. Checking the clock, I saw it was only early afternoon. My next shift wouldn't start until late evening, giving me a few hours to calm myself. But the days seemed to pass in a haze. I couldn't stop thinking about David's voice, his ominous tone, the stifling silence when he paused before answering my questions. Despite being off duty, I felt compelled to act. I tried calling Susan's number again, but there was no response. I debated calling the hospital, but as I didn't have a fresh request from her or David, it felt like I might be overstepping. Then again, our station had a contract with Susan for these regular appointments. It wouldn't be that odd for me to confirm her status with a local hospital. That's how the next domino fell. 4. Late that afternoon, after pacing my small living room for over an hour, I grabbed my phone and dialed the hospital's main number. I introduced myself as a dispatcher from Station 14. The nurse on the line recognized my name immediately. We coordinated so many patient transports over the years. When I asked if Susan was admitted, the nurse sounded surprised. "No, we haven't had her in since. Let me see," she said, the clicking of a keyboard in the background. "No, she was discharged a couple of days ago after a fainting episode during her dialysis. She never came back." My blood ran cold. David had indicated that Susan was readmitted, that she was too sick to make her next appointments, but the hospital showed no record of that. Something was definitely off. Anxiety twisted my stomach into knots, and I started to feel slightly lightheaded. The nurse must have sensed my concern. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, but laced with that professional caution nurses often develop. I swallowed, not sure how much I should disclose. "We were scheduled to pick her up for dialysis, but her son said she was too unwell. He suggested she might have gone to the hospital, but apparently she never did." I swallowed, not sure how much I should disclose. "We were scheduled to pick her up for dialysis, but her son said she was too unwell. He suggested she might have gone to the hospital, but apparently she never did." Silence hung between us. "Could she have gone to another hospital?" the nurse asked. "Eventually." "It's possible," I said, though I knew from experience that Susan always used the same hospital for all her care, routine or emergency. She'd been going there for years. "I'll look into it. Thanks." I hung up and stared at the phone as though it might start speaking to me. David's behavior was making less sense by the hour. If Susan had been home, but was too sick for dialysis, why wouldn't they call us to bring her in? Or at least let her doctors know? And if she was readmitted somewhere else, why not mention that to us? As the sky began to darken, I tried to push these questions out of my mind and get ready for my next shift. But the pit in my stomach wouldn't go away. That dream from earlier, the silent figure in the chair, it kept surfacing in my thoughts. When I arrived at the station that night, the mood was more somber than usual. Perhaps I was projecting my own dread, but the other dispatchers and paramedics seemed subdued there. Voices hushed. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed even more glaring, stinging my eyes, as if trying to reveal everything I didn't want to see. I logged in and scanned the schedule. Susan's next dialysis appointment was in the morning. Protocol said we'd have a crew check in with her first. Given that David wasn't answering calls, we'd make the usual call to the hospital to see if she was there. If not, we'd send a crew to her home in person. The night passed in a tense crawl. I busied myself with routine dispatch tasks, updating schedules, responding to a handful of urgent calls, an elderly gentleman who suffered a heart attack, a woman in pre-labor pains. Each time the lines lit up, my body jolted, the adrenaline surging, never quite settling. Through it all, Susan lingered in the back of my mind, like a ghost in an old house, drifting through the corridors of my thoughts. Around midnight, a group of paramedics returned from a transport, and while they took a break, they came by my desk to chat. One of them, Matt, had known Susan for years. He had ferried her to dialysis countless times. She'd apparently crocheted him a scarf one winter, which he still wore because it feels like a lucky charm, he'd once joked. "Hey, any word on Susan? She's still not feeling well?" he asked, leaning on my desk. I tried to keep my composure, but I could feel the tension in my jaw. "David said she's not up for her appointments," I replied carefully, "and that she's been in the hospital on and off. But the hospital says they haven't seen her since she was discharged. It's confusing." Matt's brow furrowed. "That doesn't sound like David or Susan." He paused. "Well, especially not Susan. She hates to miss a treatment. She always says she'd rather endure the misery than leave too many toxins in her blood." Matt's brow furrowed. "That doesn't sound like David or Susan." He paused. "Well, especially not Susan. She hates to miss a treatment. She always says she'd rather endure the misery than leave too many toxins in her blood." The paramedic next to Matt, a woman named Haley, nodded in agreement. "She's a stubborn one," she said softly, a hint of admiration in her voice. "I hope she's okay." "Same here," I said. My voice felt hollow. "We'll try calling again tomorrow. We can't just show up unannounced." A shrill ringing cut me off, forcing me back into dispatcher mode. Another emergency call. The paramedics nodded at me, and as I picked up the line, they hurried away to prep for possible dispatch. But this call was different. Instead of a frantic request, there was nothing but dead air for a moment. Then faint static. My stomach twisted. "Station 14, what is your emergency?" I said, my voice slightly shaky. "Nothing." "Station 14, do you need assistance?" And then I heard breathing. Labored, raspy breathing, like someone struggling to draw air. My heart pounded in my ears. "Hello? If you need help, please speak." A click, and the line went dead. The silence was louder than any scream. 6. I tried to shrug off the incident, telling myself it was likely a misdial or a crossed line. But the rational part of my mind was failing to quell the steady, insidious fear that had begun to coil in my gut. The rest of the night shift dissolved into more tasks, more phone calls, a few staccato bursts of radio chatter from the field. I kept half an ear out for anything from David, half an eye on the phone logs, hoping for some sign that Susan was okay. Nothing came. Finally, dawn broke, the sky a pale, sickly gray that seemed more oppressive than comforting. The morning dispatcher came in, relieving me. As I handed over the binder of overnight notes, the phone rang again. The other dispatcher answered. He turned to me with a quizzical look. "It's the hospital, checking on a patient named Susan?" My heart lurched. I stepped closer to overhear. The morning dispatcher put the call on speaker. A nurse's calm but concerned voice filled the small office. "Good morning. This is Nurse Thompson from County General. I'm calling about Susan. We just wanted to confirm if she was scheduled for dialysis this morning. We saw that her last check-in was never completed. She's not here, and we were wondering if your unit was transporting her." I swallowed. "This is Kay, the overnight dispatcher. We've been trying to figure that out ourselves. We've been told by her son, David, that she's been too ill for dialysis and that she'd been in the hospital, though your records say otherwise." I swallowed. "This is Kay, the overnight dispatcher. We've been trying to figure that out ourselves. We've been told by her son, David, that she's been too ill for dialysis and that she'd been in the hospital, though your records say otherwise." A long pause crackled through the speaker. "Right," the nurse said eventually, her tone measured. "We did discharge her a few days ago, but we have no readmission on record. If she's been readmitted, it wasn't here, or she did so under another name, which is quite unlikely." A claustrophobic silence wrapped around me. The day shift dispatcher rubbed his jaw, looking worried. "Well, we'll try calling her residence," he said. "And if we can't reach her, we might need to send a crew to do a check." "Understood," the nurse said. "Keep us updated, please." "Will do." The line clicked off, leaving us with only the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I felt a chill run through me. Even the day shift dispatcher, usually unflappable, looked unsettled. "That's strange," he muttered. I nodded. "Very strange." Exhaustion weighed on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something awful was happening. I clocked out and headed home, the drive passing in a blur of stoplights and gray drizzle. When I finally tumbled into bed, sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, my dreams were once again consumed by that same spectral image of a figure on a couch, motionless, the flicker of a TV screen casting long, twitching shadows. The next day, my phone woke me earlier than I'd planned, my heart seized with adrenaline. Before I even recognized the number, it was the station. The moment I answered, our station supervisor's voice, tight and urgent, spilled through the receiver. "Kay, we just got word from the crew we sent over to Susan's place," he said. They knocked and David answered. He claimed she was still in the hospital, but something didn't add up, so they asked dispatch to call the hospital again. I sat up, nearly dizzy with dread. "And? She's not there. Hasn't been." Crew radioed in that the house smelled off, like something was rotting. They said David looked, well, they said they can't put their finger on it, but he looked wrong. And he was smoking inside, not caring about anything. My blood felt like ice water in my veins. Did they find Susan? No. David wouldn't let them in any further. He just insisted she wasn't there and closed the door. So the crew left and called us. We decided to contact the police for a welfare check. A wave of nausea hit me. And what did the police say? That they'd send someone as soon as possible. Haven't heard back yet. My breath caught in my throat, panic rising. I wanted to ask a dozen more questions, but the supervisor had to go. He said he'd keep me posted, and we ended the call. I didn't know what to do with myself. I paced my tiny apartment, phone in hand, waiting. My Mind was a swirl of horrifying possibilities, none of them good. I clung to the idea that maybe Susan was alive, just hidden or neglected. But deep down, a grim certainty clawed at my thoughts. Hours crawled by without word. Eventually, I had to go to the station for my evening shift. By then, the sky was darkening again, clouds rolling in like a tattered shroud. The wind had picked up, and the trees lining the street bent and rattled, scattering leaves across the asphalt. The stormy weather felt like an extension of my anxious heart. When I arrived, the phones were oddly silent. The paramedics, who had gone to Susan's house, had left for a new call. My supervisor was tied up in meetings. I settled at my desk, with trembling hands, trying to ready myself for whatever might happen next. Then, just as the clock ticked past 8 p.m., the phone rang. The shrill tone made my entire body jolt. I braced myself for another chilling conversation. "Station 14, Dispatcher K," I said, my voice taut with dread. The voice that answered was low and authoritative. "This is Sheriff Brady with the county Sheriff's Department. I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you requested." I froze, heart pounding so violently I could hardly speak. The entire station seemed to tilt. Under me, the overhead lights glaring like an interrogation lamp. "Yes, Sheriff," I managed, forcing air into my lungs. "I'm here." "Go ahead." His next words made my vision blur, and my stomach dropped to my feet. 8. He was calm, but I could hear the strain in his voice. "Officers made contact with David at the residence. He initially insisted his mother was simply unwell, but at home. The officers requested to check on her directly. After some reluctance, David let them inside." My fingers dug into the edge of the desk. The station around me disappeared, replaced by the sheriff's voice, the dreadful images it conjured in my mind. "And?" I whispered. "And they found Susan all right," he said, his voice heavy. "She was dead. And not recently." The air vanished from my lungs. For a moment, I thought I might black out. "The sheriff continued, his tone grim. "The officers found her on the couch in the living room, wrapped in blankets and propped up, facing the television. By the state of the body, she'd been dead for at least 2 weeks." My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. "God," I whispered, stifling a sob. "We're still investigating," the sheriff went on, sounding weary. "David has apparently been changing her clothes. He says he's been watching TV with her. Claims that she didn't like to be alone, so he kept her there. We're still investigating," the sheriff went on, sounding weary. "David has apparently been changing her clothes. He says he's been watching TV with her. Claims that she didn't like to be alone, so he kept her there." My vision swam, tears threatening to overwhelm me. I'd known something was wrong, but I never imagined this. The idea of sweet, soft-spoken Susan left to rot on that couch, while her son doted on her, cared for her in death in a way he never quite did in life. It was too horrifying to contemplate. A wave of guilt crashed through me. Had I pushed harder, maybe I could have prevented that final 2 weeks. Maybe she was beyond help anyway. Still, the regret was overwhelming. I thanked the sheriff in a trembling voice, promising that our station would cooperate with any investigation. When I hung up, the phone seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. The station was eerily silent, like a mausoleum. I glanced at the door. A cold draft had slipped through, making the hair on my arm stand up. And then I saw him, or thought I did. A fleeting shape in the reflection of the door's window. A silhouette in the hallway behind me. Just a trick of the light, I told myself, my stress and terror conjuring illusions. But my heart pounded with a primal fear I couldn't rationalize away. Susan was dead, and had been for weeks. David had lied, telling us she was in the hospital, that she was too sick for dialysis. Meanwhile, he was preserving a grotesque parody of normal life in that living room. My eyes burned with tears. As the enormity of the horror set in, the station's walls felt as though they were closing in, suffocating me. My entire body trembled. I couldn't get the image out of my mind. A small, frail woman's corpse, dressed in fresh clothes, sitting on a couch, maybe with a blanket over her knees, as if she were just dozing off during her favorite show. The sickening smell that must have hung in the air, the blank stare of her lifeless eyes. My imagination turned vivid with terror. I tried to push the thoughts away, but it was futile. The horror had already embedded itself in my mind like a splinter beneath my fingernail, impossible to ignore, impossible to remove. The hours following that phone call were surreal. A heavy pall hung over the station. I told the other dispatchers what had happened as soon as they were gathered. Their reactions mirrored mine: shock, disgust, and a deep sadness for Susan. Most of them had known her, or at least recognized her name. She had touched so many lives here, always with a smile or a piece of homemade craft. Amid the shock, I felt an unshakable anxiety simmering beneath the surface. My dreams, my sense of dread, they all felt validated, yet that gave me no solace. If anything, it magnified the guilt. Somewhere along the line, we'd all failed Susan. Or maybe it wasn't a matter of blame, but it felt that way. The phone lines lit up with routine calls, and we handled them as best we could, but nobody felt quite normal. The paramedic crews came and went with somber faces, many of them shaken by the news. A hush enveloped us, like a collective mourning for Susan, overshadowed by the nauseating details of her final fate. The phone lines lit up with routine calls, and we handled them as best we could, but nobody felt quite normal. The paramedic crews came and went with somber faces, many of them shaken by the news. A hush enveloped us, like a collective mourning for Susan, overshadowed by the nauseating details of her final fate. David was taken in by the authorities for psychiatric evaluation, or so we heard. The rumor mill churned with speculation. Some said he was in deep denial or psychosis. Others claimed he'd always been off, but that this went beyond anything they could have imagined. News like this would normally spread rapidly through local media, but in truth, a lot of these small-town horrors never make big headlines. They linger in the background, known only to those involved, like an ugly, rotting secret. I finished that night shift in a daze. When dawn came, I stumbled out of the station into the cold morning air. Birds cawed somewhere overhead, their cries eerie against the pale sky. I half expected the world to look different, darker, twisted, but it was just another day in the suburbs. Cars crawled by, and people went about their morning routine, blissfully unaware of the macabre scene that had unfolded just a few miles away. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Susan, not the sweet, elderly woman crocheting scarves, but the lifeless figure on the couch, marionetted by her son's deranged devotion. The smell of rot, the vacant stare, the blankets carefully tucked around her shoulders to maintain the illusion of life. My mind tormented me with these details, and, even though I'd never actually witnessed the scene, I could see it with terrible clarity. For nights on end, I tossed and turned, haunted by nightmares. In them, I would be alone in a dark living room, flickering TV casting shadows on the walls. In the faint glow, I would see a shape on the couch, a bundled figure, unmoving. I would approach, heart hammering, desperate to make sure she was all right. Every time I'd reach out, something pulled the blanket away, revealing not Susan but a twisted, decayed face. The eyes would snap open, milky and accusing, lips drawn back in a silent scream. I always woke in a sweat, gasping for air, sometimes even biting my lip until it bled. During the day, I tried to function normally. My family and friends noticed something off about me. I didn't want to talk about it, partly because it was an active investigation, and partly because I couldn't stomach repeating the story. It was too raw, too horrifying. Despite my exhaustion, I still had to return to work. Dispatch never truly stops, and we were a small station with limited coverage. Each time I entered the building, I felt a crushing tightness in my chest, as though the station itself had absorbed some malevolence from Susan's ordeal. Always felt narrower, the fluorescent lights harsher. Every ring of the phone set my nerves on edge, conjuring the memory of static and David's eerie monotone. I tried to bury myself in routine, answer calls, dispatch crews, log times, track statuses. But, inevitably, I'd see Susan's name in the system's records, reminding me of her appointments. We canceled them, of course, once we knew, yet her name still floated there, an echo of a life that had quietly ended in the most disturbing way. The rest of the staff grappled with it too. I overheard them whisper about David, how he'd fooled us all, how he kept her body there for days, weeks. Some speculated that maybe he wanted her disability checks or some twisted sense of comfort. Others guessed he was in a complete psychotic break, clinging to the belief that she wasn't truly gone. Either way, the result was a horror that felt like a dark cloud over our small station. The rest of the staff grappled with it too. I overheard them whisper about David, how he'd fooled us all, how he kept her body there for days, weeks. Some speculated that maybe he wanted her disability checks or some twisted sense of comfort. Others guessed he was in a complete psychotic break, clinging to the belief that she wasn't truly gone. Either way, the result was a horror that felt like a dark cloud over our small station. 11. About a week after the discovery, I found myself driving near Susan's neighborhood, purely by coincidence, as I was running errands. I passed by the road that led to her house, and an uncontrollable urge seized me. I turned my car onto that street, my pulse quickening with every passing house. What was I doing? What did I hope to see? Some closure, maybe, or proof that the nightmare was over. My heart hammered. The street was lined with modest single-story homes, well-kept lawns, and a few scattered autumn decorations. Jack-o'-lanterns, faded plastic skeletons. It all seemed so ordinary, so suburban. And then there it was, Susan's house. A small, pale green structure with a single-car garage. The curtains were drawn, the front yard eerily still. A "No trespassing" sign was posted on the door, presumably placed by the authorities. The driveway was empty. My chest constricted at the thought of what had taken place behind those walls. I pulled over, rolling down my window just enough to see. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves. My breath caught in my throat when I spotted something. Near the window, a small crochet decoration, perhaps one of Susan's projects, hanging from a hook. A chill shot down my spine, tears pricking at my eyes. Suddenly, I sensed movement. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw a shadow pass by. But the house was supposed to be empty, sealed for investigation. My heart nearly stopped. I strained my eyes, willing the figure to reappear, but I saw nothing else. Maybe it was just my own reflection in the glass, or a flicker of my imagination. Or maybe it was David lurking inside the sealed home, which would have been impossible, right? That was enough. I pressed the gas and pulled away, my hand shaking on the steering wheel. My chest felt tight, a swirl of fear and sorrow, as I sped off that street. I returned to my routine, though it hardly felt routine anymore. Days blended into nights, nights into days. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it brought nightmares that left me soaked in sweat and paralyzed with dread. I kept seeing Susan's name pop up in my daily logs, even after we'd removed it from active schedules. Phantom entries that vanished when I blinked, like the system was glitching. But it wasn't. At least, that's what I told myself. I was just imagining it. Stress can play cruel tricks on the mind, especially when trauma lingers so near. One evening, I was in the station alone again, covering a late shift because we were short-staffed. The hum of the fluorescent lights made the silence feel even more acute. I busied myself with updating rosters, filling out forms, anything to keep my mind from drifting. And then the phone rang, a piercing trill that made me flinch. "Station 14, Dispatcher K," I said, my heart already racing. A crackle of static, loud and abrupt. My stomach clenched. "Hello?" I repeated, dread creeping up my spine. The static seemed to subside slightly, and for a moment I heard that horrible labored breathing again, like the ghost of a memory I'd tried so hard to forget. I froze, tears springing to my eyes as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then, in a faint, distorted voice, I thought I heard Susan. "It's impossible. She's dead. I know she's dead." But the voice, weak and breathy, whispered something like, "Help me!" I gasped, nearly dropping the phone. "Susan?" I choked out, my voice trembling. No response, just more static that crackled and hissed. Suddenly, the line went dead. I sat there, phone clutched in my hand, staring at the silent receiver. My mind whirled with panic, confusion, and outright terror. This couldn't be real. I was exhausted, traumatized. Maybe I'd hallucinated the entire call. My rational mind tried to calm me, but my body refused to stop shaking. I checked the caller ID. Nothing, just like before. I scrolled through the system logs. No record of an incoming call. It was as though the station phone had never rung at all. 13. The days that followed felt like a slow descent into madness. I couldn't escape the sense that Susan was reaching out from beyond the grave, trying to tell me something. I told no one about the phone call. Who would believe me? They'd say it was a coping mechanism, a stress-induced auditory hallucination. And maybe it was, but it felt so real. I heard her voice, so faint yet so recognizable. Outside, the weather continued to grow colder, the daylight hours shorter. The leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and red before falling away, leaving the trees barren and forlorn. The shift in seasons matched the hollow feeling in my chest. One night, after a particularly restless day's sleep, I found myself looking at the old ambulance logs for Susan's transports. I was alone in the station again. My shift always seemed to isolate me these days. In that endless quiet, I pored over her records, each ride we gave her, each hospital she visited. She was such a constant presence in our operation. Seeing her name appear and reappear in these logs felt like paging through a memory book. I tried to find some pattern, some explanation, anything that might give me closure. That's when I noticed a small note in one of the entries, a detail that hadn't stuck out before. Patient says her son sometimes forgets to feed her. Arrives at dialysis slightly dehydrated. I stared at that note for a long time, remembering how the paramedics had occasionally mentioned that David wasn't the most attentive caregiver. It was all so heartbreakingly mundane at the time. I flipped more pages, scanning each dispatch record for any detail about David's behavior. Another line surfaced. Son refused to allow paramedics inside for pickup. Patient eventually came out on her own, unassisted. I took a sharp breath. So this had been an issue for a while. Yet we all chalked it up to family dynamics or David's anxiety. We never imagined it was laying the groundwork for something far more sinister. I flipped more pages, scanning each dispatch record for any detail about David's behavior. Another line surfaced. Son refused to allow paramedics inside for pickup. Patient eventually came out on her own, unassisted. I took a sharp breath. So this had been an issue for a while. Yet we all chalked it up to family dynamics or David's anxiety. We never imagined it was laying the groundwork for something far more sinister. An uneasy feeling gnawed at me. I thought of David, dressing Susan's corpse, talking to her, as though she were alive. I couldn't begin to fathom the horror of that living room, the smell, the gradual decomposition. How could someone exist in denial so deep? A sudden noise rattled me, a loud bang on the station's back door. My heart leapt to my throat. The paramedics on duty were all out on calls, and the front door was locked. So who was at the back door in the middle of the night? Steeling myself, I rose from my chair and inched down the dim hallway. The overhead lights seemed to flicker, or maybe that was just my nerves. My breaths were shallow, and my pulse thudded in my ears. Another bang came, harder this time. I reached the back door, peering through the small window, half expecting to see David's face twisted with mania. Instead, it was Matt, one of our paramedics, looking pale and frantic. I exhaled sharply and unlocked the door. "You scared me to death," I said, voice shaking. "What's wrong?" He rushed in, eyes wide. "Haley's down," he blurted. "We were in the rig, returning from a call, and she just started convulsing, lost consciousness. I called it in, but we were closer here than the hospital. I need your help." Fear for my coworker overrode my lingering terror. Without hesitation, I sprinted with him to the ambulance bay. Haley lay on the stretcher, unconscious, her face ashen, her body unnaturally still. My training kicked in. I radioed for an immediate second unit and started checking her vitals while Matt administered oxygen. My hands moved on autopilot, taking her pulse, checking her pupils. A million scenarios flashed in my head: aneurysm, stroke, epileptic seizure, allergic reaction. Her pulse was erratic and her breathing ragged. We rushed her to a second ambulance that arrived minutes later, sirens blazing, and they sped off to the hospital with her. When I was finally alone again, I realized my hands were still shaking. Two horrifying events. In a matter of weeks, Susan's death, and now Haley's sudden collapse. The station itself felt cursed, like it had absorbed too much grief, too much death. My mind began to spiral, half convinced the line between the living and the dead was wearing thin, that Susan's restless spirit was lingering here, sowing chaos. I hated thinking that way. It felt melodramatic and superstitious. But in the grim quiet of that station, the possibility didn't seem so far-fetched. I handed in my resignation 2 days later, citing stress and personal reasons. My supervisor seemed sympathetic, but also disappointed. We were already short-staffed. I felt a pang of guilt, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. On my final shift, I was paired with another dispatcher the entire time, so I wasn't alone. The station seemed less ominous with company, but I still jumped whenever the phone rang. I spent most of the night training my replacement, avoiding direct eye contact with the phone lines. Part of me dreaded a final call from beyond the grave, a last haunting farewell from Susan, but it never came. I left Station 14 at sunrise, stepping into the cool morning with a heavy heart. As I drove away, I cast one last glance at the squat building. It looked deceptively normal, washed in the pale light of dawn. Yet I knew the darkness it held within, and the darkness it had awakened in me. I found a new job outside of emergency services, something quieter, calmer. I hoped that, over time, the nightmares would fade. Some of them did, or at least became less frequent. But, even now, years later, I can't watch a TV in a dimly lit room without seeing that flicker of a bundled figure on a couch, unnaturally still. I can't sit alone in a dispatch center or an office late at night without expecting the phone to ring, bringing me that cold whisper from somewhere beyond. Susan's memory lingers, a reminder of how thin the line is between normalcy and horror, between the routine calls and the nightmares waiting just beneath the surface. It's become the story I can't escape, the ghost I carry with me into every quiet room, every flicker of fluorescent light. Some nights, even now, I dream of picking up a phone and hearing a voice say, "Kay!" And when I turn around, I see her, blanket wrapped, eyes milky white, lips parted in a silent plea. I wake up with my heart pounding, drenched in sweat, and remember that life itself can be more terrifying than any campfire tale. Because sometimes the darkness doesn't come from a monster lurking in the woods. It comes from the quiet house at the end of a suburban street, where a mother sits on a couch, forever waiting, and a grieving son tries in vain to keep her in his life, even after life itself has fled. I wake up with my heart pounding, drenched in sweat, and remember that life itself can be more terrifying than any campfire tale. Because sometimes the darkness doesn't come from a monster lurking in the woods. It comes from the quiet house at the end of a suburban street, where a mother sits on a couch, forever waiting, and a grieving son tries in vain to keep her in his life, even after life itself has fled. And the worst part? No one else knows. There's no newscast, no sensational headlines, no viral stories. The world moves on, oblivious. But for those of us who were there, who heard the calls, who pieced together the missing days, haunted is too soft a word. We're trapped in a purgatory of what-ifs and if-onlys, forever replaying that final moment when a sheriff's voice confirmed the horrors we feared all along. So if you ever hear a phone ring late at night, and the line crackles with a breath that shouldn't be there, know that sometimes the dead do cry out. Whether it's real or just the echo of our own guilt, it doesn't matter. The chill in your blood, the dread in your heart, that's real enough. And that's the price we pay for living in a world where nightmares slip through the cracks of everyday life, seeping into the spaces between each ring of the phone, each flicker of a fluorescent light, each memory of a sweet old woman who never made it to her last appointment.